Welcome to Behaviorally Speaking Leadership for Changemakers, where leadership is grounded in behavior, guided by dignity, and designed for change. I'm your host, Dr. Esther Bubb. Let's dive into today's episode. Hi, Kevin. So nice to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining. How are you feeling coming into today's session?
I'm good, Esther. Thank you for having me. Interested in talking about the topic.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, let's get us started off a bit with talking about your leadership journey, Kevin, and your perspective. So can you tell us and can you tell the listeners about your leadership journey and then what led you to pupil services and special education?
So, yeah, it was kind of a roundabout way. And so I taught blind and visually impaired students. And in doing that, I worked in Pennsylvania. We have intermediate units, and they provide, various services to their local schools. And so I worked in an intermediate unit that spanned over 2 counties. And so likely in a period of 5 years, covering various maternity leaves and staffing shortages, out of, I don't know, maybe 14 districts, I was probably in like 12 of them. And so I was able to see kind of like how other districts work in an interesting way, right? So, in education, everything is, very much generally structured. And so you could see in one district that had more resources, education looked different. In another district that didn't have as much resources, education looked equally as different. But through that, it gave me, I think, a lot of perspective on how to be a leader. So I think as much as having put miles and miles on my car being an itinerant teacher, it also gave me a perspective as a leader because I was able to gain a little bit from every place I was at, right? This worked well here, this worked well there, don't do this again. And so I think that's what sort of started it. And so then over time, I went back, I had my master's degree to teach vision and O&M. I went back to be a school psychologist because I was really interested in that kind of work when I was at the IU. And then in doing that, I realized, that necessarily wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to have a broader impact on students. And then I learned about the supervisory path, right? And so, so I started down that pathway, and you go through your internships, you have an opportunities that because you're an intern, they give you not challenging things, but things probably that are more no one else wants to do them, so to speak, right? So it gave you an opportunity to, sort of try those things out, learn who I am. And, then I became an administrator. I first started in a rural district, out in the center of the state, and then, transitioned down to Southeast PA, where I was a supervisor of special education. Then I became the director of pupil services, and I worked in 2 districts and an intermediate unit. In pupil services and special education, which is what I oversee now, I look at pupil services as, not to sound corny, but sort of the unsung heroes behind the school system, right? If things are going well, you don't necessarily know these folks exist, right? School social workers, school psychologists, guidance counselors, home and school visitors, folks that do really important work for often more marginalized groups. You don't see a social worker unless you might have, an issue that requires that. And so I really respected that kind of work. And then, obviously, supervising special education, and running those programs, I've done that, for a long time. And so, it was kind of a natural thing for me because they both sort of go hand in hand, right? So school psychologists, identify kids, now with, coming out of COVID, we still have, many students that, like, as a BCBA, there's different kinds of behaviors and behaviors tell us something, right? And so, so is it, truly a behavior concern? Is it, lacking certain social skills that would have been developed during normal play that was limited for a period of time? And then, I think of myself, as a teacher, we were one of the first, as an educator, we were one of the first people to be able to have access to the vaccine. But the toddlers and the infants, that came like about 2 years later. So you have a period of time where that's, a really important time in child development where kids likely were being sheltered more than they they were being sheltered appropriately, right? Because there was no vaccine. And so because of that, it sort of made me even more interested in like the pupil services side of things, right? And so, and then how can you make systems that support the whole student when really school is primarily about learning, right? So like it's, so pupil services, I look at it as they're systems to remove barriers. So for students who require it, school health, vaccinations, lots of controversy around that, but there are laws that we have in Pennsylvania that require them. So it's a balance, but that's really where it started. I think I saw in working with students with visual impairment, particularly, how important access is, right? And if something's not accessible, not just the universal design kinds of things, but you literally, can't read print, and so like how important that is, and how much of a universal floor, so to speak, literacy is. And so, so that's really, I think, what pushed me towards leadership, was having those opportunities, sort of just by chance, seeing how other schools have worked.
Yeah. One thing that, thank you so much for sharing that history. It was really, really good to hear. And, one thing that made me smile when you were talking, you talked about like, sort of like the itinerant world where you're driving, doing a lot of driving, traveling, but you're exposed to so much diversity and experiences. So I always love that, like being a BCBA, going to different schools, different homes. But my position now, it's really itinerant. So I do enjoy that. But I also love the fact that you pointed out pupil services. It kind of really helps remove, through the individuals assigned to those roles, right, remove barriers. And it makes me think of, just the world of behavior analysis, but the world of education is identifying skill deficits, for example, and implementing and recommending strategies to help the student succeed. But in all of that, Kevin, so in all of your years and in all of my years, obviously, don't have as many years of experience as you, but I have some. And my perspective, has evolved over time for a number of reasons, Kevin. It's like, first of all, I'm from a different island. I'm from Grenada, right? So there's perspectives there, there's experience there, there's here. Learning new things, going back to school, like getting, certifications, interacting with people like yourself. So over time, my perspective on leadership has evolved. We talk about COVID, we talked about, just technology, all of those kinds of things. How has your perspective evolved, Kevin, on leadership over the years, especially within like school systems?
I think, sort of going back when I first was an administrator, it was literally like the day before Thanksgiving, I was a teacher. Uh,
Mm,
the Monday after Thanksgiving, I was an administrator, right? So like people are looking to you for the answer. And I'm looking behind myself, seeing who's going to give the answer. Honestly, it was, they talked about baptism by fire, but like it was an urgent time when I was in
yeah.
that district, right? And so that district went through, cyclical monitoring, which all schools do. And I forget, I was maybe the third director of
Mm,
that district since they went through cyclical monitoring. And because they always would joke that, like the laws don't cross certain mountains in Pennsylvania, right? And so being in central, PA, some things that I regularly saw where I was a teacher, those practices just didn't happen. Not because people didn't care, they didn't want kids to learn.
yeah.
They just sort of didn't know. And so my first role is it was helping people learn that. And so I think when I think of the question is like early on, it was really about compliance and, sort of getting the job done. It
Mm-hmm.
was,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I think back and, I'm sure your experience as a BCBA is, like it's task analysis, it's
Yeah.
backwards modeling,
Yeah.
what do we want the end to look like? Uh, and so it's really easy to be able to say, this is what it should look like. It's really hard
Mm-hmm.
to get people to do things that have always done something that they think is correct in a different way, right? And
Yeah.
so then,
Mm-hmm.
you sort of, just rely on, sort of pulling it out of people, um, you know, you know, knowing that they're coming from a good place and they just don't know.
Yeah.
So in that position, and I think that's what sort of that position really helped me become who I am today, is I was able to work with, because they were on like 3 years of corrective action, only because no one ever finished it. And so it gave me an opportunity, to work with people in the Department of Ed, to work with people in the patent systems, to really be able to get sort of like a more global system view of compliance as a piece. Compliance, like I heard a metaphor. Compliance is like the floor of
Ye-
of instruction.
Yeah.
It's all the other stuff. It's all the other good work that teachers do on top of that. And so I think what I've I've grown into is, one, you gain confidence by doing it, right? And so,
Mm,
um, you know, in Pennsylvania, as in other states, you're required to do special ed plans.
yeah.
Uh, they're kind of formulaic, but it's something that has to happen, and it asks important questions about like your system and how you're meeting certain needs. And so, you know, you always, every so many years, you sort of have to ground yourself back in that. But part of that process is about becoming better, right? So
Yeah.
like what professional development is important for my community uh, to move forward to support students with disabilities. And, so I think it went from, uh, you know, early on more of a compliance, like this is how we have to do it, uh, to there are multiple ways of getting to the same result.
Yes.
Um, my way works for me, and I kind of look at it as what I do now is I don't want a mini me. I want people to be individuals. I look at it as I set the guide rails or the guardrails on the highways, so to speak.
Yeah.
Like people shouldn't, but people can sort of weave in and out and make it their own. But we ultimately get where we're at, and we're staying within sort of the confinements of the law, right? And so it's ensuring that you're going to get where you're going, whether it's going straight ahead or taking 10 stops. And back when I first started, it was like a bull in a china shop, right? So like I had people regularly from the department and from patent helping and from our IU helping, this thing just needs to get done. And this was before it was electronic. It was like 3 giant binders of problems that all had various stages of being started. So I sort of joked that like I went to bed reading like the Pennsylvania regs because the next day people would ask me about them. And, so it kind of, I never taught math, but I'm not great at math. And so I sort of equate it to like just staying a couple of weeks ahead of the class, so to speak. And so if I knew something was going to be coming up in regards to evaluations, I'd make sure that I would, read up on that and what the processes are. And then it's networking and finding out how others have done it. I think you sort of grow into who you are, and you establish sort of non-negotiables, but then you also recognize that there are a lot of different ways to get there. And, ultimately, it's about the destination ultimately for the delivery of service. The journey might look a little bit different just based off of people's skills. And so like I try to take what their passion is and get them excited to head in a different direction with that same passion, right? So it's like some of it's like that whole idea of change theory. People, like adults, do what they do because they're comfortable doing what they do. To do something new is uncomfortable. And so,
it is.
But it becomes comfortable when you do it a lot. And so, it's really about helping folks identify what the end looks like, and ultimately helping them figure out their own path to that within, sort of the framework that we have to work within.
Yeah. No, I like that. That makes sense. And some of what you said throughout, but then also towards the end, it reminded me, and I feel the same way, like moving from directing people, right? Because growing up and looking at people in different positions, especially growing up in Grenada, you see a lot of directing happening. But like you're saying, it's more to like developing them. So seeing skills they have and then helping them maneuver to this thing or this project or this goal or this idea that we see the skill in. So it's less about directing them and more about developing them. And I really like the analogy you gave of however you get there, sometimes it doesn't really matter as long as you get there, right? So for example, to get to Box County, I may take the Turnpike or 95. At the end of the day, I'm still getting there. Right? So how people get there does really, they can choose that, but as long as we're supporting them and helping them develop from where they are to where they could be. And even for me, Kevin, I think it was just a movement away from believing you had to know everything, right? Because, just from your conversation, it's like, all right, let's read up on this. Let's learn about this, right? So being committed to growth and continued knowledge. I remember when I just started adjunct teaching, I had a BCBA was at the job where I worked as a consultant. And so I said to her, well, I'm starting this new teaching gig and I'm not sure what to do if a student asks a question and I don't know the answer. And then I will always remember her response for as long as I live. All she said was, then you just say you don't know and you will follow up, or let me get back to you. I have to get some more information, things like that. But it goes along with what you're saying. It's like we don't know everything. But there are people in our corner who might know what we don't know, or, we can research and find the answer. So that all of that makes sense to me, Kevin.
Well, and I think what you just mentioned is the ability to say when you don't know something. It's the humility, right? So people need to know that leaders of whatever, schools, corporations, governments, they don't know everything. right? And so
Yeah.
they rely on, people around them to help grow them. And so, uh, I think of every place I've worked that I had a leadership role, I knew what I could do.
Yeah.
But when it came an opportunity to hire somebody, I wanted to hire somebody that was not just like me, but had skills that I didn't have, right? Because that was going to help me become better. Uh, but then also it takes a little bit of weight off of the leader when you can say,
Yeah.
you know what, I have a school psychologist who's also an administrator. Let me run this by them, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
this is what I think. I go,
Hmm.
but that's really not my area of expertise.
Yeah.
So let me get back to you. And I would want that from my medical provider, right? Like I don't want them guessing just because I paid my $20 copay and say, well, this is what you got. And so,
Yeah.
if they don't know, then you do tests. And in education, I remember this was like early on, somebody shared with me, like, we're really kind of like diagnostician teachers, right? So we gather all
Yeah.
of this data, like all of your behavioral data when you're coming up with your, what is the function, and you analyze that,
Yeah.
um, and by doing that, you get a theory. That theory might not pan out, but you still have the core set of data that you come back to it and you reflect on, right? So it
Yeah.
goes back to like we're always learning. And so enjoy what I do, right? So
Yeah.
people on Facebook, like I follow Bulldogs and, special ed chat groups and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to hear that the challenges that we have in education and particularly in special education, um, and school leadership, everyone's sort of going through the same thing, right? And so,
Yeah.
and being able to read what, people are struggling with uh, and the ideas that others offer, there's so much still left to learn. Uh,
Yes.
and so I think, like you mentioned, like the humility to be able to say, I don't know, and I'll get
Yeah.
back to you, and then really getting back to them, right? So like I
Yes.
think that's the important thing too. It's the follow up, So if like people won't people will lead you if they trust you, or they'll let you lead them. I mean,
Yeah.
and but that trust has to be built over time, So and that's the honesty of saying, hey, I'm going to get back to you. I don't know,
Yeah.
and I don't know that. What's the phrase? I don't know that yet. And so, it's
I like that.
always coming back to, like we're all sort of learning this together. And so,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's an important part of the journey because,
Yeah.
we've all read the books about leadership and, um, sometimes and the benefit also of a long commute is I get to listen to some books on audio books,
Yes.
and it all really comes back to being open to learning new things, and the humility to know when you don't, right? And so
Yeah.
I think that's an important skill to have, and as a teacher I never really thought of that because
Mm.
if I had a question, I'd be asking my supervisor. I needed an answer right away, kind of a thing. Like, what do you mean? You got to go figure this out. Like, if you
Yeah.
don't know it, how am I supposed to know it? And so, but again, having done this for a while, like you recognize, like every day there's something
Yes.
fresh that no one likely has ever thought of, or in my mind, and so you're always learning something new, and um, I enjoy, the easy way of being doing professional development, like the jigsaws and stuff like that, where you pull apart different journals and, like, what does this group think of this journal article? Because I'll read it and I'll get something completely different out of it. Because I'm coming through, similar as you mentioned where you grew up, I'm coming through my lens of the life I lived and my experiences. And, so when people bring up something, I'm like, oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way. And then you hear about their story and then you realize, okay, well, that is why they thought of it that way, right? They had things they lived through that I didn't. So I think that's also important.
Yeah, 100%. Another thing that's important, Kevin, is systems level thinking, right? So this was a couple of years ago now, well, more than a couple of years ago, but I was the behavior analyst for a student, right? And he really loved silos. So there were pictures of silos, anything with a silo could be a reinforcer. And then, moving into leadership roles and education roles, we hear and we know about, really focusing on what we do in terms of us being a system and really trying to stay away from that siloed mentality. So it's interesting how for one person, silos are this big deal and, something that they really enjoy and they're into. And then in other systems, it's like, we really need to focus on being a system and not siloed where this department is doing this thing and this one is doing something different, right? How can we combine our resources and knowledge and, work together? So how would you operationalize, Kevin, system thinking in your role, and what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, it's interesting because I think people find comfort in silos, so to speak, right? So it's the world that they know the most of, right?
Yeah.
And so even now, I see where I work with a group of seasoned administrators, and there are certain items that aren't completely shared. And, and unless you ask a very specific question, right? And so I'm not sure if that is, sort of a form of silo, but it seems as if, unless you have the right question, they're not going to give you that information. They might not be knowingly withholding it.
Yeah.
But I had a conversation recently where I thought the topic was very specific, and then I asked, I don't know, a rather naive question, and then they gave me a whole background of where we were. Well, that would have been good to start with, because sometimes it's good to know where we came from, to better help guide where we're going. And so I think, unfortunately, like silos still exist to a degree, but I think, if you sort of step back and think of why people generally got into education, right? You want to help. I got into it because I wanted to help people who could not do something better, right? So a visually impaired person cross a street, right? And so, so we all have that, that why we got into it. And so I think it's sort of tapping into that when you're thinking of the system, because like I admit, I find curriculum development like a bit boring. And so, but some people are loving it. But I just love the chaos of special education and the knowing that I'm doing the right thing for the kid. But what I'm doing for the kid to support that student and that family also has curriculum all surrounding it, right? It has all these other different pieces. It has like the resources. So like you talk about like your business folks, right? It has your staff. So you talk about your human resources folks. So it's really about, I think where silos fall is when you can sort of unify around a thing, and then you bring sort of your specialty to that table. So, it sort of goes back to like, you want to surround yourself with smart people that aren't necessarily like you, right? Because you that helps you think of it, of the system. And so, like something that we struggled with, as many schools have, is in regards to attendance following COVID, right? And attendance always has been a tricky thing, but with COVID, that sort of opened up people's eyes to the fact that, various technologies can be used to help move kids forward. And where I'm at currently, a unintended consequence was in our high schools really making the courses so specific on the learning platform that you really don't need to be in school to be able to maintain a decent grade point average, because all of the assignments are on the Canvas page, your submission of homework is on the Canvas page, interactions are required on a Canvas page. So it reminded me of when I was taking some online courses to the University of Wisconsin, where once a week I would Zoom with the professor every other evening. I'm doing it on my own, and so we have to figure out, or we are figuring out, okay, what's the hook to get these kids into school now, right? Like they're learning, but they just don't want to come in the door. And, so then it becomes, it's a family thing, it's like, like no one wants to argue with a teenager, right? Families, work, so like if they're not getting out of bed, that doesn't mean you can be late for work, so sometimes, it's something as simple as you need to go to school, which back when I was in school, that wouldn't have been a system that would have needed to be developed. That would have been my dad making sure that I did do it. And so, but now it's, because you don't want to punish the student, right? Because you don't want to, for little kids who can't get to school, often it might be a family dynamic that is allowing that to happen. For older kids, it becomes a path of least resistance. Do you want to, argue with your teenager all the time? So we really had to reflect on what do we need to do, and, sort of rethink the idea of, asynchronous courses, Canvas courses. What do we need to have on those learning management systems? If you have everything, then the kid doesn't need to come to school, right? And so, like, you want to have certain things. You want electives, where they're coming in and they're interacting with STEM activities that you really can't do, through an online system. But everyone sort of had to buy in because, again, during COVID, so much flexibility was provided, right? And so it became very easy to sort of look the other way. And I remember when at where I'm working now, we had a corrective action for special ed subgroup, right? And their attendance. And their attendance, and we actually did, or that district, I wasn't there at the time, they did because of all the flexibility the state and the feds provided, they gave an extra year of kind of like virtual learning, right? Or, which probably in hindsight wasn't the best idea, right? And so, because that was the year that we got dinged, or they got dinged, and then I showed up. So then I got dinged on kids not attending, and the attending or the rate of attendance was at 50%. And I was like, obviously statistically speaking, that's like chance. And I go, did a teacher ever go into the classroom and say, you know what, there's supposed to be 15 kids in here. There's only 7. Where are the rest of them? Or did they go in and be like, whew, thank goodness those other 7 stayed home. And so I think with the system, like it relies on people interacting, right? And so
Yeah.
like it's not a static thing. So like the idea of a silo, I don't think that anyone purposefully wanted that to
Hmm.
happen,
Yeah.
but no one brought it to anyone's attention,
Hmm.
nor was it something that, because of all that flexibility that was provided, did they need to, and so now that things are sort of back to normal, it's helping uh, everybody get used to it. I remember uh, one of my secretaries, her child was in the high school, and they made a comment, for 2 years, no one really was concerned that we weren't coming. Now what's going on? And so it was like, well, kind of a thing, like, coming to school has always been a thing. COVID is over. And so, we have to sort of rally around that. But what was interesting is that, some administrators, not that they didn't see the value of it.
Hmm.
There were just so many different priorities that get in the way. And so, and I know we've
True.
talked about this before. It's like if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. And so,
True.
so we really, tried to, you know, create a campaign, every student, every day. Your attendance matters. Small things going through PBIS. Uh, and so it was redeveloping a system that
Hmm.
did occur, and it just shows you how fragile they can be, right? Like if and during the first year of it, uh, it was Kevin's attendance system, or it's Kevin's attendance project, and I'm
Yeah.
like, it's not Kevin's project. I go, the state says kids need to come to school. I go, it's like turning on the lights. I go, it's all of our priorities. I
Yeah.
go, I got a little bit of heat from it because we realized that some special ed students weren't coming. But then when we looked more broadly, a lot of students weren't coming. They
Mm.
just weren't in the subgroups that are being monitored. And so,
Murdered.
uh, so that was particularly a challenge because by then the system completely was broken. Parents didn't see a value in it, so it's trying to convince parents again that coming to school is important, even though they can access their stuff at home, because that was the other thing that came out of COVID. All the curriculum now has either a hard copy book, but it also has the online version, and so you can, in a way, get away with being out of school for a period of time as long as you're continuing to do the work. Uh, and so you had to get buy-in again from parents. They had to recognize going to school was important again. Uh, they had to establish systems in their home. We had to provide uh, resources on things that prior to would have just been common sense. An alarm clock. Regular time to go to bed. Take the device away. Right. During COVID,
Yeah.
everybody was on their devices. Many people were learning on their devices because of the inequity of technology, and so uh, you know, the one parent was up front that the kid is on their iPad until like 3 a.m. Well, if you're up till 3 a.m., well, if I'm up till 3 a.m., I'm too old for that anymore. And so, but for like a young kid, like when, they're developing, like their bodies can't adjust to that. So yeah, they're sleeping in past their alarm, and um, so coming back to the silos, it's really about having people. I think people find comfort in the silo, but it's when you have, what Covey, every leadership program I've ever was part of, read his books. It's like that
Mm.
it's like the North Star. Like what is the one thing that everyone agrees upon?
Yeah.
And like, how can we bring all of our collective knowledge from the various backgrounds and the various specialties of learning to create a system. And for me, and I know for you as a PCBA, it's kind of like that task analysis. This is what we want to do. This is the part I can do towards it. What other parts can other people play based off of their background and their role in the organization. So, a systems is sort of only as good as the parts that make it up. And if people don't buy into what the it is, it easily falls apart.
Yeah, 100%. And you mentioned, a system, is just as good as the parts of that system, right? And so I think and then you talked a lot about COVID and technology and virtual instruction. And so it brings to mind, Kevin, that, COVID, the world shut down 6 years ago. We're in 2026, but I can tell you, and I believe you would say the same, that COVID led to a lot of systems level change, right? Even if we were just talking about virtual instruction or virtual IP meetings, right? Things like that then really benefited students. So some that I think about, not necessarily relevant to COVID, is moving towards more of an inclusive model in early childhood programming, right? So, at one place where I worked, Head Start and early intervention were two separate ideas, right? In other places, it's one idea. It's early childhood programming. So you might have some early intervention students, placed into Head Start or pre-K counts classroom, right? So they have that inclusionary opportunity, but also that staff are seen as one, right? We're all here working for the benefit of the students. So that's one I can think about. Another one was redesigning our referral process, right? Where it then decreased the amount of time, the lag between the receipt of that referral and when that evaluation actually occurred, and then, the subsequent IP meeting, where that benefited students. One that is very passionate to me was, as you know, I supervised, BCBAs that were up and coming. So then I sort of presented and led this program where in their training, we did it together at first, right, Kevin? So we would go to preschools because of the high rate of suspensions and expulsions. So we would go to preschools, we would do training, but sort of on the preschool level, right? Had nothing to do with a particular child having an IP. And then we saw we targeted schools, right? We got feedback from, say, for example, itinerant teachers. Tell us some schools, right, where you've seen high levels of suspensions and expulsions. Then we met with the director, offered this proposal, and they're like, yeah, sure. So then they would go in, initially monthly, and then we would fade it off, offer support. And then we still behind the scenes did trainings. And then eventually I phased out and just let them lead it. So those are some examples I can think of. What are some examples you can share, even if it's one example, Kevin, or a system level change that led to meaningful impact for students?
I think, so something that we're working on currently is ensuring that it's sort of refining the MTSS process and the PBIS process and the SAP process and all these processes that are very similar in what the objective is, right? So they're all designed to support students, but kind of in a different way, right? And so, MTSS, I look at it as kind of like the umbrella under which a PBIS system works, like your student assistance program works, because you can't have because all those require meetings, like you talked about, going in and I sort of identifying the problem, and if we can't be meeting all the time, sometimes at some point we have to teach. And so, it's really about becoming efficient. And that's something we're working on now, because we have these, this culture of we've always done it this way, right? And so PBIS has a team, MTSS has a team, SAP has a team, parent instruction, all those different pieces have different teams, but ultimately it's the same goal, right? And so it's helping people sort of see that, and it's hard to see it. it's even hard for me to envision it, because knowing each one of those things is like, I've learned each one of those things as they became the thing, right? So like RTII or RTI became RTII, then MTSS, and then, PBIS came along, and, that made a lot of sense. Kids aren't going to know how to, you aren't innately born knowing how to walk a hallway at school, right? So you need to be taught certain things. And so it's all about teaching. And, then it's the dreaded, state assessments, and, are people meeting their benchmarks? And so, so we're currently working on, sort of how, to unify all those separate good things into a system that's not going to leave a kid behind, and not to be corny, but leave a kid behind, so to speak, because they fall through the crack. They don't need, like, if MTSS was purely academic, they don't really need the academic stuff, right? They have some behavior issues, so you might say, okay, so they need some PBIS kind of things, SEL, but then when you pull back that layer, you see sort of like the student assistance and the issues that are happening in the family, and the work that needs to be done with the family to bring them along. So what we're struggling with is how to make MTSS encompass all of those things with all the right players at the table, right? Because you're not going to be successful working with families if if you don't have a background, for example, in like social work or counseling. And so, but there aren't that many of those people, right? So you can't have everybody at every meeting, or all you're going to do is doing meetings. And so what we're working on, and we were, I think some of it it's like self-reflection, right? So it's looking at my department and how my department can help with sort of like the specialty people that I supervise or I manage, in a way that works with the whole student at the systems level. So it's, what does that look like for someone who never saw it? And it's, other than reading a lot about it, I haven't seen it either, and so, touching on all of those specific pieces about, 5 or 6 kids every week in an hour when you're pulling together, MTSS, SAP, PBIS, it takes a lot of thinking. And so, but again, I look at it as like, it's sort of like the end result in mind, right? So you referenced about sort of taking on the struggle of preschool suspensions, right? And I remember seeing something in the paper recently where I think the state of Pennsylvania was going to try to put some pressure on private preschools for suspension. But if you don't know anything better, you're just going to do what you've done, right? And so, that's where it comes in, and so, it's a lot of caring people with various backgrounds, helping people understand something that is important, such as behavior. If you can, I would imagine, you probably weren't successful with everyone, right?
Right. Yes.
But the ones that you're successful with, they see the value in it, and then they, maybe not intrinsically, but they have the gut feeling that this is going to work, right? And so, and then they want it to work. And so much of making a system work is wanting it to work.
Yes.
And because they want it to work, like maybe it's not going to stop all suspensions, right? But if it reduces, a quarter of them, you have a quarter of students that are now staying in school that are benefiting from an early learning experience, and will be more prepared to go to kindergarten than previously, where it likely was, you did this, you're out. And, so it's those little wins, I think can help shape behavior, as a behavior analyst, it's about shaping behavior, right? And so my undergrad was in psychology, and, so I sort of joked that, I taught a rat how to ring a bell and pull a lever to get a drink of water, so behaviors can be shaped and systems can be built with the right motivation. And, so I think it all goes back to, like, are we all motivated for the same thing, right? So in finance or in the business world, it's, making the next best thing, or developing a product that people don't know yet that they need. And so, where in education, it's a little bit more black and white, but you also have all these other factors, such as human beings, and everything that they bring to the table, that impact it, so it's the social, it's the social value, or do parents believe that their kid should be in preschool? Like, are they pushing back and saying, no, I don't want my kids suspended anymore. You need to try to figure something else out. And then you have, unfortunately, well, we're a private school, so you're welcome to find another place to go, and so, it really is a struggle to develop systems, but I think a lot of it comes through, and this is just based off experience, it's sort of like the behavioral lens. You have to find that hook, the thing that people want to do. And so, similar to like a strong behavior plan, or planning a vacation, so to speak. If you can get a whole group of passionate people sort of around one topic, I think you're going to have some success. And then it's that big picture view. So the example that you gave is, one that it's pretty common. And so we know that students in preschools are being suspended, particularly students of color, at a larger rate. And, and then we're surprised when they're not ready for them to be at school. And so because they didn't have the opportunity or those pre-learning skills, necessary to adapt and to fit into that sort of culture of learning, because that might not be the culture of where they're coming from. And so, I think it's about having, clear expectations, being there, answering questions, similar to what you said before, admitting when you don't have an answer, getting back to them, making things that are unclear as clear as possible. One of the things, and I'm not good at it at all, is this whole chat GPT or AI stuff, right? And so what I started doing is, when I'll sort of make a procedure, I'll put it in the system, and I'm not anyone who is going to listen to this is probably going to think I'm from the Stone Age with AI, but I'm like, if you were reading this, please break down the steps that I outlined, and like, tell me what it says, right? Like, I know what I think it says, but I know what I think it says because I wrote it, right? And so if I was using this AI, we just started learning more about it, but they said, like, use it as a learning partner. And I was like, well, that's kind of like a weird thing. Like, it's not like Terminator or something, but I'll use it to to question what I do. So like if you were the receiver, or, you are a parent of a blah, 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 and you receive this message, or you are a teacher and we're implementing X and you receive these directions. Are these directions clear? And what would the result be that you would do? And so oftentimes it'll, spit out what you want, and then it will provide ideas that I never even thought of, right? And so, so I it's, in some ways it's just being like relentless and not giving up is the factor that leads to success. And there are days that you want to give up, right? That it's just hard to get out of bed, and then you just have to, do what I look at it as like once you get in the door, then it's like you're back to where you started, and it feels good. But it's hard work to change systems, to develop systems, to lead people who think that they are doing the right thing, and that may have been very good 10 years ago, but it's not what kids need now. And no one likes hearing that, so it's, that's where it comes in, like sort of being the human piece of it is helping people be okay with not knowing, and be okay with asking questions, and being okay with making mistakes. And when those things sort of come into play, a lot of good things can happen. But you have to have the environment to allow that to happen. And so many environments are more conducive to like more robotic thinking, right? Like, you must do this, you must do this, we have a rule for this, where like we could have a rule for everything, but where's the rule to make rules, kind of a thing. And so like you have to sometimes reflect back on like what's best for you. And if you were in that situation and you needed something, I often find myself asking, like, well, what is our system for this? And they're like, well, every building does it differently. Well, then that's not a system. That's a way of doing things. But if we want each, because where I work now, we have 6 elementary schools. We want everybody, all 6 elementary schools, to experience something similarly, right? So it's, these are the non-negotiables. Those 6 elementary schools go to 3 middle schools, then they lead to 1 high school. So you have to, and that's one of the things that we're sort of working on is vertical alignment of our curriculum, particularly in special education and our specialized programs such as autistic support. If everyone's sort of doing something different, and then you get to sort of like the pinnacle, right, to the high school, it becomes really hard for that teacher to teach when everyone had a different experience going along their path of learning. And so, we've really been leaning into like the ABA and, structured teaching, and because we have to, like the end result requires us, our end result isn't making a car, it's making a person be better than who they can be, that will then go on and do good things.
Yeah. You spoke a lot about behavior, Kevin, right? The environment. You talked about like shaping motivation, right? It's so important in what we do, because if motivation isn't there, what we want to happen is just not happening. Let's be real. And then if motivation is there, Kevin, what we want a child, for example, to stop doing, they're going to keep doing it. They're so motivated to do that. And whatever we're offering them is just not as motivating, right? So saying all of that, Kevin, and thinking of behavioral leadership in practice, like from a behavioral lens, how do we shape and influence behavior? And in your perspective, it's a lot more, right? So like, if we start with just the child, like there's one teacher and one child shaping that child's behavior, but then we think of the classroom, we think of the school, and on your level, we're thinking of districts, right? How do you intentionally shape and influence adult behavior across the district?
I think some of it is, I think it comes back, you know, a unified plan and or a system or a what. And so it's identifying what is and getting people to buy into it. And so most people don't want to, I believe, most people don't want to do things the wrong way, right? You know, so it's sort of having everyone agree that this isn't working. How can we make it better, right? And, small teacher groups, like what are some ideas you have? What are some ideas you have? Because we all lead to one high school where I'm currently at, like they all have to get up there and do what high school kids do. And so, so we can tell what middle school they sort of came from, right? Based off of, a lot of factors. Some places do PBIS and SEL better than others. So it's about not necessarily systematizing that, but making what is done universal. So we want, say there's 20 things that would be great for a freshman in high school to have experience in. What are the 10 that we can guarantee that everybody is going to have in the exact same way? So when they get to the high school, they can be successful in their learning. Those other 10 things are maybe they're good to haves, right? But they aren't the crux of what the learning that is happening at the high school requires. And so, and our high school's rather large. It's, there's some towns in Pennsylvania that are smaller. And, so in many ways, like PBIS or not rules per se, but like this is how we operate, like standard operating procedures, so to speak. Because you're going to get what you give. And so like if you don't give them those tools, you're not going to see them coming back to you. And so it's agreeing on like what are those key priorities and how can we instill them in such a way that one, the kids buy in, right? So that goes back to what you said. You can't make a behavior become important unless the kid thinks it's important. But then you also have to have the teachers believe it's important. You have to have administrators, building principals believe it's important. You have to have school boards believe it's important. You have to have other district leaders believe it's important. So a lot of it is, drafting or crafting a message that people can you can smell, you can taste, exactly what the end result's going to be. And that end result, to use the food metaphor, tastes delicious. So everyone wants it, and so, so it's finding what that is. And so, for some students, it's, access to, a variety of extracurricular activities. Well, you can't participate in these activities unless you come to school, you have certain grades. So that becomes a motivator. So in my mind, so much comes back to like behavior. It's what is the motivator behind that? I always sort of joke that like there's very few people or Sunday evenings are like, oh my gosh, I can't wait for Monday, right? And so, a motivator for people is, financial, right? And so, but there also has to be more than that, because you could be paid plenty of money and not feel value in your position. And so, so it's finding what that it is, and then sort of replicating that, and using people's emotions. And this sounds awful, but and it might be my background, but shame can make you do things. And so, if you know another teacher down the hall has sort of the same profile of class, and they're seeing success and you're not, I want to go down to that classroom and see what they're doing that I'm not doing, or a building principal in a building the same size as the one that I'm leading, they're having great success in activating their parent groups and their PTOs around like a common sort of mission and vision for what they want the school to be. I want to know what that is, because those are the tangible things that make kids want to stay in school. It makes teachers want to stay teaching. I mean, we're in a field where, now it's been a while since I worked in an organization where I really had to know all this stuff, but I know that talking with our HR director, who was at a few job fairs, very few are going into special education, right? And so, we know that. And so, but it's only compounding, right? So at some point, everyone's going to be fighting for the same people. And so, and in Southeast PA, we all kind of pay about the same amount of money, and so then it becomes about the culture, right? Like, where do they want to be? Do they want to be in a place that is, real rigid and sort of overly structured, or do they want to be in a place that provides, like the guide rails, freedom to be a teacher, as long as you're sort of staying on the road, so to speak, right? And I see the value in both. If you're in a really large organization, for example, perhaps like the city of Philadelphia, where it's so big, it's really hard to get anybody to sort of stay on the road, so to speak. But then when you're in organizations that might be smaller, it can be so rigid where it just isn't it doesn't feel comfortable, right? And so, because everything is being either micromanaged, or you start feeling as if you're sort of a cog in the wheel, like that you don't matter, right? And so, things are going to continue to happen whether you're there or not, because, in some ways you're just a body that is pushing the message that is coming from above, right? And so, I think it's finding that motivator, having people agree on it. They have all these, things during professional development, put dots on certain things, and, most dots are what you agree upon. And, generally they're on the things that you sort of know about, most people, you don't pick the thing oh, I'm not even sure what that is. But it's but when you have, strong-willed people who are determined to get X done, there really is no stopping them. But they have to have the ability and the freedom to do it without fear and without, sort of the over-scripting of things. And so I've seen, at one district I worked at, we implemented a new reading program, and and it was different. And I was an IEP meeting, and it was contentious. And a parent was asking the teacher about the reading program, and it was new. And and she, got upset. The teacher left. The parent had, their attorneys. Our attorneys were there. And I got an earful from the principal about how I didn't, close down the meeting or how I didn't support the teacher. I go, what the parent asked was a reasonable question. Like, how are you teaching my kid to read? I go, an answer could have been, this is a new program. This is what we're doing right now. And, because it's new and because of our professional development, we're learning it as we go, right? So this is what we're doing currently. And I can get back to you, with, what the next skills are going to be if you want to do some pre-teaching at home. But running out of a meeting crying isn't relaying an air of confidence to that family, right? And it wasn't, and so the suggestion was that they were put on the spot. But if you're okay with not being the expert, as we talked about earlier, the humility, you can say, what, this is new to us too, so I understand that he's struggling with this. We're still learning it, and we're getting better. And this is what you can do at home, because that's really what the parents wanted to know, so you flip the question to, how can I help you better understand this kind of a thing, rather than I'm being attacked. And, but it's ultimately the goal, was helping students learn how to read. So it's, if everybody can sort of agree on the what, then how to get there, as we talked about earlier, could be a ping pong machine, but you're still going to be getting there.
Yeah. You talked about culture, Kevin, in your response, and it brings to mind, cultural shifts, especially when people are already immersed and embedded in a culture, and when there are long-standing practices that are no longer serving the students well, right? How do you shift culture and mindsets in those instances?
I think first, I think you have to respect where people are coming from, right? And so, so much of, I'm not going to, years ago when they called it the new math, right? And you would hear at meetings, parents not being able to help their child because they didn't understand it, right? To me, that's a communication problem, not a systems problem. And so, a solution to that would be evening events, using Zooms, using different forms of media to help parents better understand the what, when you make such a shift, right? I think culture is what makes a system, a school, an environment, what it is. Changing it takes a lot of time, but if people see the value of the why of the change, I'm trying to think of an example. One that comes to mind was when I was at a district and we were focusing on conflict resolution, right? And so, and it probably loosely ties to the question, but it was a culture in which the teachers often felt unprepared for meetings. And so we wanted to give them skills that they could use to sort of help diffuse the situation. And there was an organization out of, a southern state, I forget where, that I was trained twice. And really what it's about is really like listening and validating what you're hearing, and not minimizing it, because oftentimes, folks will be like, well, I'm the educator, you're the parent, you don't know, kind of a thing. And so I found it very valuable. It's kind of like when meetings go sideways is, you get up on the whiteboard, you write like these are this is what we agreed upon. These are like we're going to come back to this. Let's put a star here. But like right now, we're going to keep moving forward because we got to get this done. And keep redirecting to that. But that helped develop a culture of, not proficiency, but, credibility, right? That they didn't always have to have an administrator at a meeting because they were afraid. They learned the skills to be able to address challenging questions. Or conversely, they wouldn't be sending me an email and saying, hey, can you write me a response and that I can send home? I'm like, well, I can write you a response. I go, but it's going to be Kevin's response. I go, so like, you got to agree to what I'm saying. And so don't just cut and paste it, because they're going to think the response is coming from you. And so, it's a culture of respect. It's a culture of mutual collaboration. Many places, unfortunately, similar to education itself is, sort of built on the, what the system of, what agrarian, farming kind of a thing with, so many days in school and so many hours and summers off to be able to help. And so like you're in a system that you're like school itself is a very, in many states and districts is very sort of rigid and has a deep cultural understanding of what it looks like. And, so it's taking what you want it to become, gathering, I think, as much feedback as you can, because you need to have that buy-in, right? So like that change theory where, you need a champion of it, so, they sort of always talk about like, in every building there's, you have your early adopters, you have your no adopters, and you have the people in between. And so much effort is spent on the non-adopters that you don't, that it really burns out the administrator, where if you put some effort into the early adopters and then to the middle level folks, they end up, just by nature of having success, sort of pulling the sort of like the naysayers along, which changes the culture. And it's also, I think, important that, and this is the hard part because, teachers, because there is such a hierarchical system in education, like sometimes teachers need to call BS on each other. Like they need to hold each other accountable. Someone not doing something reflects on all of us, not just you as a teacher. And so, I don't want to be part of a system that is, so rigid, so inflexible that, the very culture of the system isn't welcoming to kids or to families. But we also have to know that, in every school system, you have people who've been there for 35 years who started teaching, I used to say when I was born, but now not anymore, started teaching a long time ago. And, now you have brand new teachers, right? And they come in with like excitement and wanting to do new things. And sometimes you have the more seasoned teachers, sort of put a kibosh to it. There's that, and I don't watch a lot of TV, but I think it's that Abbott's Elementary.
Oh, yeah.
And they were there was, it might have been the episode last week or the week before, but it was on in the back when I was doing some work at home. And it was about like a teacher's lounge, right? And being itinerant, I never went into the teacher's lounge. So the only experience I have is really hearing about it. Certain people sit certain places. Don't you sit there? You haven't taught long enough. Just sort of and you could see kind of like the hierarchy just in the teacher's lounge. Mm. Which was fun to see because again, not having been itinerant, eating in parking lots, like I never really had that opportunity. Yeah. But also now being an educator and seeing that, or hearing, more seasoned teachers talk to younger teachers about, well, if you keep doing that, everyone's going to think that's the expectation. So you need to sort of slow down a little bit. Well, we don't want that either, right? So like it's a balance. It's the new folks, I think, need to sort of rise up in some ways, because just by mere age, they're closer to the demographic that we're teaching, and so like they relate to it, like what that 6, 7, I still don't know what that means, but like, like we had younger teachers that kind of got it, and they use that as a motivator. The other day, someone gave an example during an interview that I was in where they deliberately were asking kids to respond to, okay, what was the answer to question 5? What's the answer to question 6? And they knew if they said 7, everyone would go nuts. And they're like, okay, what about number 9? And the whole class was like, boo, you know what I mean? But like, you saw that hearing that story made me know that teacher was engaging kids, and so whether it's the 6, 7, whatever it is, it's the hook for kids that gets them motivated. And we need to find the hook to get the adults motivated to change a culture, right? And so, I think no matter what size of the school, culture is hard to change. The longer people become comfortable in doing what they've done, the harder it is to sort of wrestle with the uncomfortableness, right? And so people, you sort of always default back to, what you're comfortable with. And, I know that, there were plenty of times in my career where, like, a shift happens and you can try to delay it, but you're not going to stop it, and so at some point you could give in, which I think is, somewhat like quitting, or you can sort of embrace it, right? And be like, okay, how can I make this work for me? And so, and I think that's a lot of when people think of changing culture, if they understand what is, being at a culture of inquiry, like, how do I make that fit me when I'm a teacher, but I'm supposed to be the knower of everything. But now you want me to be inquisitive and be open to asking questions and learning from people who are, oh my gosh, they're 20 years younger than me. I'm supposed to learn from them. They're supposed to be admiring me. And, so it really is, I think it's like self-reflection. It's, as corny it is, it's the lifelong learner piece of it. Like, what was good 5 years ago probably isn't so good now. And that's just the nature of it. And you see that in research articles, like where, science of literacy was like taboo 10 years ago. And now you have whole states, embracing it. Reading is a science. It is not something that is natural. And having friends who are multi-language learners, talking to them, English is one of the hardest languages to learn. And I never would have thought of that. But they had they saw the value in learning that to help them change themselves, right? So they put in the effort. And many of them are, some of my friends, work in higher ed that are multi-language learners. And so in that respect, it was, sort of the cultural or a mindset of lifelong learning, a mindset of self-improvement, a mindset of, I need this. I have a very close friend who is from Ukraine that now works in higher ed, and listening to what occurred when the Soviet Empire separated, and those states that were so reliant on the empire to sort of keep everything together, so to speak, right? Talk about a culture, right? Like that was more of a forced culture. But when that forced culture left, you had states just sort of falling apart because they didn't know how to lead. So because, so that culture that empire made was, again, it was totalitarian, but it served a purpose because the individual states never were required to develop the skills, the talents, the resources, the knowledge to self-govern. And so, I just think like culture is such a big piece when you look at it more globally, but like breaking it down, it really comes into like it's built by repeated behavior. So how do you change repeated behavior? Well, you know how to do it. It's the BCBA, right? I mean, like, you have to find something that is as rewarding as the behavior that you want to change. And so, so like you have to make the new thing as exciting as what they think their comfort level is. And that's sort of the art of it. It's believing in something so much that like people can sort of feel it coming out of you, so to speak. And like I know, like, and this is not culture. It's just because of in my position, I don't get to see like a lot of little kids. And I had so much fun the other day when we had our one school was like one something where they had the Eagles mascot come out, and that school also has some students with autism, and some of them were like afraid because it was a lot of sensory info, and I loved it. Like I had to be there because somebody raised money, and I was there to give the check to somebody, which I guess is part of my role. But like what I love, because the autistic support teachers were in the back because their kids were, overstimulated. And I'm like, let's get up front. And they're like, oh my gosh, it's going to be too much. I go, it's not going to be too much. I go, the kids are going to love it. I go, like so much of, like if we're afraid, they're afraid. And so I grabbed the one kid's hand. I go, we're going, buddy. We ran up there and we couldn't get the student to touch. I forget the name of it's an eagle, but it has a nickname. But like I touched the eagle, the kid touched me, so like it, it was something that the kid never had an experience to do, right? And so,
Yeah.
so some of the times it's just doing it and hoping for the best. I mean, that could have been a complete disaster if the kid, uh, you know, had a reaction that wasn't, favorable. But, uh, you know, then we got the whole group up there, and Swoop is his name, and so like then
Yeah.
Swoop did pictures with the kids, and then I was like, well, I don't want just the special ed kids together, so let's get each kid go find a friend. Well, how some classes are, they might not know other people, so I was just like, you get up here. I go, we're going to have fun, and we're going to have fun together. And so sometimes it's just, it's, you just have to have the will and
Mm-hmm.
and maybe it's because of the place I am in the organization. People just sort of follow along. I have no idea, but it was just an exciting time, and I got excited too. I was like, these kids aren't going to have this opportunity again. And so
Mm-hmm.
how can I how can I help them make a memory that they're not going to have? And culture ultimately is about memory. And so, um, and, we all want to reflect back on positive memories. And so you try to create that culture in which you sort of shape that.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't shape something of people that don't want to be shaped. So it wouldn't have worked if that kid wouldn't have ran up there with me as excited as I was to have him meet Swoop.
Yeah.
I didn't care anything about Swoop, but but I just knew it was so special for that school, and everyone was having so much fun. And like, and I remember the AS teacher was like, she's like, "Are you sure?" I'm like, "What's the worst that can happen?" I go, like, we, it's not going to be. Sometimes being uncomfortable has to become comfortable, and
Mm-hmm.
by protecting, some of our most vulnerable kids from this sort of natural kid stuff, um, it might serve a purpose. Maybe that afternoon those kids were just regulated, and the teachers were all angry at me for getting Swoop involved in the classroom. But again, it's a memory that they'll always have, and I think of like the parents that have students with disabilities, all the milestones that those families may not have experienced, but now they have a picture of their child with Swoop, with a middle-aged man, but that, who cares?
Yeah. Kevin, to just close us out for tonight, right? You talked a lot about becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? And that is advice I give to, right? So for aspiring leaders, Kevin, right? What advice would you give them in terms of leading, and especially leading with humanity and purpose? Would it be become comfortable with becoming with being uncomfortable, or would it be something else?
I think it's like lean into it.
Mm,
Be okay with it. Uh, be willing to, as you mentioned, say you don't know, but that you'll get back to them.
mm-hmm.
Um, when someone wants to be led, or when you're in a position, or in some ways, I think of being a leader as a coach. Uh, you have people who may not know something yet,
Yeah.
and our role is to help them learn that. And so, it's staying focused. The student is the center of what we do, um, and it is, so so many people get sort of caught up with the data and not the person that surrounds it, right? The humanity, the human, that you sort of, I think you have to be, as corny as it says, you have to lean into being uncomfortable. You have to be okay with being vulnerable. You have to be okay with, and I guess some of this goes back to my experience teaching and my graduate program out at Pitt. Part of it was working in a neonatal intensive care, and it was very humbling when when a family or is expecting a child. They have a lot of dreams for that child. And when you have a child that might be disabled, those dreams might not become reality. Mm-hmm. And so, as you mentioned, working in preschools, the grief of that is really hard to overcome. And so, it's trying to envision yourself in that situation. It's recognizing that though we really like consistency, inconsistency is going to happen a lot. And there's nothing that we can do. There's no system that we can put in place that's going to make everything perfect. So, I really think it's about, sort of leaning into the uncomfortableness and being okay with that. And that's hard to do. It's hard as a leader that presents to, school boards and other organizations that that look to you to be the expert. And I think many of us are experts in many things, but we also have to know that just like a primary care physician, I wouldn't trust doing brain surgery on me. I have to trust people. I have to be trustworthy, and I have to be willing to give and to follow and give my trust to others. And to do that takes a sense of vulnerability, right? And so to be vulnerable is scary. And so I think it's like sort of leaning into that. It's accepting that, it's recognizing that it's normal, and that not every day is going to be perfect. But you start with the expectations that it will be. And more often than not, people live up to your expectations. And so it's about clarity. It's about purpose. And I think it's about kindness and belonging. We want our students, whether students with disabilities or not students with disabilities, to feel that they belong to a culture, for example, that they belong to the school that they're in, that they're a welcome and valued member of that school. And for some kids, they're leaning into uncomfortable things too, right? As you mentioned with preschool kids, you have to, they have to be okay with, but we have to teach that, and we have to model that. And I think that's where sometimes we fail, is that if you take the idea of a teacher being the, unfallible leader of the class, that's what they're going to sort of think that that's what leadership looks like, where I think a real leader and it's the humility, and it's being humble, and it's recognizing your own failures or insecurities and overcoming that and letting others see that helps you become a more legitimate person that people want to follow. People don't want to follow a robot that's perfect. They want to follow a person. So if that, I guess, being uncomfortable with being uncomfortable is kind of the nature of being a leader. If every day was perfect, I'd probably wonder what went wrong. Because no day is. And, just when you think you know something, you are humbled. And so if you have that attitude that you have, like, you're infallible and you know everything, education, leadership will crush you and run right over you. So it's sort of embracing that, and it's rolling with that, and it's finding joy in it. And it's, it's, as your question started, it's a journey. You don't get there overnight. I've been doing this for about 20 years. And so 15 years ago, I probably would have had different answers. And so, but that's, I think that is what part of, as I now have become what I used to refer to as a seasoned teacher, or rather than an older teacher. Now that I am seasoned, like a good steak, like I need to, help others. And so, because, what I might think is just natural became natural because I learned it the hard way. And if I can help people not go through some of the struggles that I went through by, sharing different perspectives, or I think that's really what the value is in helping people grow, and sort of the importance of mentorship. I know that's, I never had a mentor. You just sort of figured it out. Now, because these jobs are so hard and so few people want to do them, just figuring it out isn't fun. And so then people leave, so if we're going to continue to have a system, we need to be willing to share what we've learned, and and walk the walk with them. So many of I have some newer supervisors, and whoa, do they get wound up? And I love the passion, but that kind of passion is going to kill you. and so I said, we need to take it down a notch, because like if we're this anxious about something that we can solve, when something is really hard, do we then quit, right? And I think we all got where we are because we're not quitters, right? And so it's instilling that that sort of passion for learning, and that sort of being okay with not being okay, and recognizing that change happens, but it happens at its own pace. And when you push it too much, someone used an example of a pressure cooker. So like when you have that much pressure, like you are going to become overwhelmed, and ideally you don't blow your top, but but it's knowing when you do get that pressure, and then also at the same time being uncomfortable with being uncomfortable means you also have to be willing to know that, and willing to find ways to release that. And that's hard to do in these positions, because oftentimes, particularly like in the pupil services realm, you're dealing with sadly some tragedies that are happening not on your time, but on the time that it happens. And so, for example, like a student death, you have to, so you're in the back of your mind, you're always knowing that something could happen. But if you let that take over, then you're living in fear. And like no one wants to live in fear. So you learn, you adapt, and you move on. So I think for those who listen to my ramblings, it's really about it's about perseverance when things are hard. It's about not giving up. It's about having the comfort in yourself to know that you believe wholeheartedly in what you're doing and that it's the right thing to do. And then finding the right people to follow you, I think helps get things done.
Yeah. I love all of that. I mean, you said a lot. There's lots of advice they can walk away with from that. Lean in, learn, adapt, move forward, and, the overarching premise of becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable. So, Kevin, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all the thoughts you shared, talking about your experiences, and it was great connecting again and speaking with you. And thank you so much again for joining.
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me, and good luck with your podcast and in your work and in becoming a better you.
Yes.
This is exciting. I never thought I'd be on the podcast.
Oh, there you go.
I never thought I'd be talking to a computer and asking me what it thinks about what I wrote either. So, every day you learn something new.
Yes, for real. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to Behaviorally Speaking Leadership for Changemakers. Be sure to visit esthercbubbabaservices.com/blog for today's companion blog and additional leadership resources. Until next time, create the conditions for growth wherever you lead. I'm Dr. Esther Bubb. Stay inspired.